Hi, this is podcast number 8 in developing ideas, and in particular looking at stories for screen narratives. In the last podcast I talked about two particular story types that were easily recognizable and many people would have seen coming at them from a long distance. These were the romance and the quest. The two I want to talk about this time are the fatal flaw and the unrecognized virtue. These two are not so obvious, primarily because they're normally used by sub-characters, smaller characters within the main narrative, or in fact the antagonist. And let's start with the unrecognized virtue. This particular story motivation for a character is hardly ever seen these days in mainstream protagonists. And in fact, the only two I can think of in recent past are in fact both Chinese-orientated films. These are the protagonists from Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, and also from Hero. However, they're often used in more minor characters and to good effect. In the old westerns, this was the sidekick's role, but in more modern films, you find Ron Weasley in Harry Potter's The Philosopher's Stone in this position, or in something slightly older, the character played in The Prostitute of Pretty Woman, where here the woman is actually not seen to be of much value to the main protagonist throughout the film, until, of course, she knows the key information that's required for him to actually win through at the end. It's this ability to actually be recognized at the end of their story motivation that sets the character who has the unrecognized virtue in their space. So let's look at this story type and how does it actually work. Well, first, obviously, your character has to have a virtue, i.e. an ability that is not really recognized by a central character, normally identified as someone who has power. Now, in this context, this virtue actually clearly has to be demonstrated on screen, and be seen by the audience, but not recognized by the central protagonist or the person who's of value to this person. We then move through this narrative with the character trying to prove their value and of being of use to the person of power, and failing, until the moment comes when the main character that we're following in this particular story type does use their skill and demonstrate their ability to the person of power. Now, whether at this point the actual problem is solved for the person of power, or in fact for the person who's got the unrecognized virtue, is really up to the storyteller. What's important is that the two characters relate in such a way that the unrecognized virtue of the one character, who's always been trying to prove their value, is actually recognized. And at this point, their clear motivation is achieved, and so the story is complete. As with all stories, this does not necessarily mean the end of the plot, or in fact the end of that particular character's presence in the narrative, because they may have another motivation going on a totally different storyline. Nor does it necessarily mean the end of the narrative. Though in many, many instances, sidekick stories actually do come to an end at the point where they prove their value. And after that, you merely have images of them in a sort of epilogue where they're shown to be with the person of power that they wanted to have influence over or be recognized by. Now, in this context, one can understand why the protagonist seldom actually follows this storyline. But in so many sort of heroic stories, this actually can become the point that you're trying to make. That they actually have a virtue that needs to be recognized at the end of the day. Now, when we come on to the fatal flaw, it's a totally different story, but in fact, the structure of it is very similar to the one with the unrecognized virtue, in that it is the ending that yet again sets it apart and makes it important. Now, the question of it being a fatal flaw is a debatable one, in the sense that fatal normally means someone dies, whereas in many TV series, for instance, or shorter narratives, where you're going to come back to the characters involved, the fatal flaw may be the sort of thing that ultimately means they never achieve the goal that they set out to achieve. And this is very, very common in sitcom characters, especially central protagonists, where they may want to achieve a relationship with someone, but they always fail to get there because of the nature of who they are. And the same may apply to someone who's always trying to impress someone, but fails in the sitcom continuously because, again, the nature of who they are. But in the fatal flaws, it was traditionally constructed for one-off narratives in storytelling, and therefore applies to short films and feature films in particular. The fatal flaw is often about the death of the character because of the thing that they hold so close to them, or is actually integral to their very character itself. Now, in this case, one can understand why this particular motivational storyline actually works for antagonists, and in particular antagonists in big action-based movies and adventure pieces and the big thrillers. One can think of all the people that Batman's been up against or Superman's been up against, etc., 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 who have a fatal flaw, and ultimately this leads to their destruction. But let's look in a bit more detail at how the fatal flaw actually works as a story. First, the fatal flaw isn't fatal at the beginning, obviously, nor is it necessarily seen as a flaw. In fact, in many cases, the very thing that ultimately is going to bring down this character at the end of their storyline is the very thing that makes them powerful at the beginning of it. They have a skill, an ability, a way of being in the world that gives them some power. This was often demonstrated in the old Greek myths and many old legendary stories, that the character ultimately, it was the source of their power that was ultimately the reason they failed. But as this story goes forward, having demonstrated the character's power as the first part of the storyline, you then have to show them coming up against a new set of problems. And initially, the power continues to be successful for them until they come up against a challenge that actually sets a whole new level. And at this point, they look as though they're going to succeed, and then ultimately they fail, because it's recognized that the very thing that's given them power has been the very source to their weakness. And ultimately they lose in their pursuit of whatever it was that skill and ability gave them. Now, these sorts of story structures, again, are still very simple. And one may think that, well, as long as I show someone with a virtue or a particular skill and then show how that's ultimately recognized or leads to their downfall, then the story's fully understood. But one must remember with all stories, it's not so much that you set up the beginning and the end, which ultimately reveals the key motivation for the character, but it's the nature of how you used the problems they encounter in using their skill or revealing their virtue that make the story worth following. And therefore, it's the very nature of how you do your storytelling from A to B that actually makes each of these stories effective for an audience.